So the hyper mechanic in the PvP arena for Illuvium is not something that you should overlook. And while it's a fairly simple concept, it's not that straightforward. In this video, I'll explain exactly what hyper is and how you can use that knowledge to build out a deck that takes advantage of this mechanic. So each unit has its own hyper ability. If we look over here at Atlas, down at the bottom here, Atlas's hyper ability is upon becoming hyper, units gain 25% attack speed. Bulwarks also gain 50% crit reduction, 20% physical and energy resistance, and max health, 8% max health plus 100. And if we look over here at Ramfi's hyper is going to be a little different because Ramfi's a fire and rogue, whereas Atlas was a water and bulwark. So for Ramfi, upon becoming hyper, units gain 25% attack speed. Rogues also gain 30% crit amplification, and on crit, burn 5 energy from their target. So for this Ombre and Phosphorus, I'm going to get into that in a minute. But first, let's explain more about how the hyper mechanic works. So this is your basic affinity chart. Water is going to beat Earth. Earth is going to beat Fire. Fire is going to beat Nature. Nature is going to beat Air. And Air is going to beat Water. But each affinity interacts with each other a little differently. So as you can see here with the lines, Earth not only gains hyper against Fire, but it also gains hyper against Nature to a lesser degree. So you can think about it as gaining 2 units of hyper as you go clockwise around this circle. And then the line going through the middle there is going to give you 1 unit gain of hyper. So as you can see here, Earth is also going to gain some hyper against Nature. Fire is going to have against Air, Nature to Water, and Air to Earth. So if you think back to the Atlas and Ramfire, those are stage 1 alluvials, so they don't have any composite synergies, they just have 1 base affinity. So for Ramfi as a fire, Ramfi will gain 2 units of hyper versus Nature alluvials, and it will gain 1 unit of hyper against Air alluvials. And for Atlas, you're looking at 2 units of hyper against Earth, and 1 unit of hyper against Fire. Now you can also think about this in the opposite direction. If you're using a Ramfire and you come up against an Earth, you don't lose any of that hyper ability against Earth. You simply don't gain it, while the Earth alluvial that's attacking you is gaining hyper. And when the hyper bar reaches max, that's when you can say your alluvial went hyper. So for the Ombre and the Phosphorus, these are stage 3 alluvials that have composite affinities. So that means you're taking 2 of the base affinities, clumping it together. So Ombre is steam, so that's the combination of water and fire. Now what's important to look at here is the dominant. So you can see in this Ombre there's a dominant fire. So even though this is a steam alluvial, when you're playing this in PvP, as it relates to hyper, this is basically a fire alluvial. And there are actually multiple types of Ombre. So you can see this one is fire. If I go over here, this has a water dominance. So again, even though it's steam, as it relates to hyper in PvP, this will act like a water alluvial. So you come back here. If that Ombre has the fire dominance, it's going to look like this. If the Ombre has the water dominance, it's going to look like this. So what you'll see some of the top players doing is actually carrying the same alluvial with 2 different dominants. So this Ombre, for example, if I carry the water dominance and the fire dominance, I can focus my deck to have a better chance of getting hyper versus whatever opponent I come up against. And for this example, with steam having the option of fire and water, you can cover quite a bit. So if you come up with a team that has a heavy air and nature, you will simply use your fire dominant Ombre. And if you come up against a deck that has a lot of earth and fire, that's when you're going to want to use your water dominant Ombre. And also if you come up against a deck that has water, you would just use your water Ombre so that no one gets hyper. And just as another example, you have Phosphorus here that's Bloom, so you can have a nature dominance or an earth dominance. And if you put the combination of these 2 Ombre with these 2 Phosphorus, and you're using these 2 as like your hyper carry, like the one that you're really going to load up with the top augments and hopefully get the most damage out of, you can cover all your bases. In this situation here, you're going to use your earth dominance Phosphorus. In this situation here, you're going to use your fire dominant Ombre, your nature dominant Phosphorus, and then for these next 2, you're going to use your water dominant Ombre. And when you're doing it this way, you can build your deck more around the class and then have your affinity be flexible. So as you can see here, for all 4 of these, for both of the Ombre and both of the Phosphorus, I picked the fighter dominant class. So I can stick with a fighter dominant deck and then be flexible with the affinity type based on what my opponent is bringing to the table. Now, there are plenty of other factors that go into whether you win a match or not. Board placement, knowing the classes, knowing what each individual alluvial's ability is, this is just one piece of the puzzle. So take this knowledge, build out some teams, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out the videos when I talk about those other pieces to the puzzle. But I hope I made this clear. I hope it was informative. Thanks for watching.